Welcome, everybody, to our December Climate Cafe. I am Dana Freeling, the chair of Democrats Abroad Environment and Climate Crisis Council. I'm calling in this evening from Dubai, where we have just wrapped up COP28, very exciting and interesting United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference. And tonight, we're going to hear from some of the people that have been on the ground and have had experience with past COPs to do a roundup of what has transpired over the last couple of, I would say, rather dramatic weeks here in Dubai. With us, joining us tonight is Larry Moffat with Climate Rising. He is calling in from Belgium, and we had the great opportunity to meet here on the COP grounds. Also, Sam Goodman is joining us from Costa Rica, and he has a plethora of experience attending many COPs and has been a U.S. negotiator and really is a great source of wisdom, expertise, and guidance for me as I have been navigating this journey this year. So happy to have him as well. And welcome to everybody else calling in from all over the world. I am calling in from Dubai, as I said, but I am a resident of Finland and I am a Texas voter. I'd like to start out the Climate Cafe by posing a question to Sam and to Larry. Fail, pass, or promise? What do you think?
I think that to understand this COP, you have to be able to have the ability to hold multiple truths. So I think in terms of having the final decision, that there's going to be a decision to transition away from fossil fuels and to have mentioned fossil fuels for the first time in COP28. It should be considered both a success in terms of the fact that this finally made it into the text, but also a failure that it took 28 years. This was in many parts a heavily financed COP. I think you could look at the creation of the Loss and Damage Fund. If you told me 2 years ago that we would have an operationalized loss and damage fund at COP28, I would have not believed you. At the same time, we only have about $650 million. It's going under the World Bank. There's a lot of different issues. When developing countries were asking for $100 billion, when the loss and damage collaboration puts a number at $400 billion, and to have it sitting at $650 million, and to have a $17.5 million contribution from the US government is pretty dispiriting. At the same time, you also see certain developing countries like the United Arab Emirates finally be able to step in the game of climate finance, with the UAE contributing $100 million to the Loss and Damage Fund. So it's just a really mixed bag. But I think when you look at the overall picture, the overall landscape, when we are, according to the IMF, subsidizing fossil fuels to the tune of $7 trillion, and the US is giving $17.5 million to the Loss and Damage Fund, it's hard to really be too optimistic. And at the same time, the US did give a $3 billion pledge to the Green Climate Fund. That's got to go through Congress. And if you look at any sort of study based on what should be considered the US's fair share of climate finance, even based on a $100 billion goal, we're looking at tens of billions of dollars. This is a $3 billion over a 3 to 4 year cycle in terms of the third or second replenishment of the Green Climate Fund pledge. So I don't think you can really say it, speak in terms of it bilaterally, but yes or no. But it's I guess a mixed bag as usual.
Larry, your initial thoughts on when we can get into the weeds. There's so much to cover here this evening, so many aspects of the results. What were your initial reflections after last night's final conclusion?
Well, I think to say whether it was a failure or a partial success depends on what your expectations were. Mine were not particularly high, so I thought it started off really well with some important pledges on methane. As Sam mentioned, the Loss and Damage Fund is now operationalized, to use the COP terminology, even though it's clearly not enough, but it's a start. And it was a real roller coaster of emotions then, within the last 2 days when there was a draft that said nothing about fossil fuels, and apparently Saudi Arabia was just dead set against the term, that term appearing in the document. And then at the last minute, as often happens, it came around, and at least it says transition away from. And the final declaration also talks about tripling renewable energy capacity, doubling the global average annual rate of energy efficiency improvements by 2030, and some other commitments. And of course, some will say, well, it leaves all kinds of loopholes. It's too vague. I've been working with the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. So they were really aiming for fossil fuel phase out. And it did that. That term didn't appear. So, maybe I guess they were a bit disappointed, but they've been pushing, from the beginning for a separate treaty. So it's clearly they, from the start, don't believe that the COP process can really work.
Well, indeed. Also, Al Gore said in one of the speeches I heard him deliver that with him, he's not beholden to any government. Gloves are off, and he's very strong in his language. And he was so angry, and he said, we shouldn't have to depend on these countries for a consensus, for a unanimous consensus. All these countries in the world should go outside the UN framework and create a pact and deliverance amongst themselves, because later is too late. I have to agree that there were really optimistic aspects in this COP on what was promised. Again, the winner was a tripling of renewables by 2030, a doubling of efficiency of energy, the Green Climate Fund, that for the first time historically in history that fossil fuels is mentioned but transitioning away. We were up very late, was it Wednesday night, while negotiations were taking place after people were outraged after the first draft. There was, in many ways it is historic. And I think John Kerry in particular, at 80 years old, I saw him day in and day out, all night on Wednesday night. He was up nearly the entire night negotiating, pushing, helping the presidency. Everybody said Al-Jaber, as the president of the largest Abu Dhabi oil company, would never give in to the Saudis, but with really pushing from the EU and from John Kerry that he compromised. He helped really bring about a diplomatic solution so that everybody didn't get what they were hoping for, but parts of what they were hoping for, most people. Samoa lodged their dissent. They weren't even in the room. They were representing island nations, Pacific Island nations. They weren't even in the room when the decision was gavelled in on, was it Wednesday? Maybe we were up all night on Tuesday. On Wednesday, they did lodge a complaint, which they didn't enforce later, but a very strong statement. And after the decision, the measures were passed, every country and representatives to larger bodies of organizations were allowed to have the floor and to express their opinions about the success and really failure of aspects of this COP. And there were some poignant and really empowering words that were communicated. I would recommend to anybody to watch the recordings. All of these are available through the COP28 YouTube site. Very powerful. The loss and damage, the concern there is, yes, there will be money that is allocated to the countries that are most impacted by climate change, but will it really go to the frontline communities and those vulnerable communities? Will that money really trickle down? So this is a very important question. Are the mechanisms strong enough to enable an energy transition in a way that those who are already in poverty aren't plunged further into poverty? That we are able to really lift up everybody's standard of living. My live streaming partner that I was working with, who's from the Democratic Environmental Caucus of Florida, we engaged in a very interesting conversation with the minister and negotiators from Iraq. Just, exhausted the last night, waiting for results. They came out for coffee, and we ended up talking for about an hour about what this terminology and the decisions would mean for them. And it gave me a moment of pause, because they were explaining how, unlike Saudi Arabia and a lot of the OPEC nations, who are vastly wealthy, whose citizens do not live in poverty, a country like Iraq has been decimated by war. It has suffering extreme water problems. It has so many political problems, so much terrorism, and so much poverty. And for their country, they said, this is vital for their survival. They said that every drop of oil, of their oil that is not sold, a child will die. And in reality, it may be true. And maybe that is the sacrifice we have to make, that millions and millions of people might die because we have to save life on the planet. But I think that the countries of the world, of the global north, and especially those oil-producing countries like Norway, the United States, Canada, have to give their fair share to make sure that our energy transition to save our planet is not going to mean plunging millions, if not billions, into further poverty and death. Thoughts?
Yeah, just on the loss and damage, I thought it was interesting that the official name now is not loss and damage, but Climate Impact Response Fund. And I watched online, one of the John Kerry's press conferences, and I think at least two journalists asked a question where they used the term loss and damage, and he responded with climate impact response. And so I was following a panel discussion on sort of how judicial action can push, climate action, sort of taking countries to court. And so I asked the question, I said, does it have something to do with liability, that if you call it loss and damage, you open the door to claims that could amount in the trillions, for what the emitting countries historically have caused and inflicted on the most vulnerable countries. And the response I got from one of the panelists, she works for Client Earth, which is an NGO, sort of a legal NGO, and she confirmed that that's probably why the name was changed and not using loss and damage.
That's so interesting. I also attended some panels on legal issues, and one in particular I found really riveting. Had representation of about 9 chief justices from Supreme Courts from developing countries, including Pakistan, which had just suffered these devastating floods last year. And the overwhelming message from them was, we want to help. We need to help. We have a responsibility to help. The most important thing is that the people are provided with adequate understanding and knowledge, and that they have armed with that knowledge, that they're able to bring cases to the courts, that there needs to be a judicial system, both at the national levels and, of course, the international courts. But at the national level, they said, the justices says, we want to do something, but we can't create the cases. The people have to bring the cases. And first, the people need to be educated. They have to understand that they have to have assistance to do it. They have to understand what the issues are. So I think in this way, it really demonstrates how important it is what we do and what organizations like ours do. And not only helping to get people to vote, but helping to educate people and spread the word.
Yeah, and I think going back to Larry.
May I have my hand up? May I?
Sure. Hi.
Hi, Dana. So there is some need of a little bit of reality here, that the reason Iraq has been plunged into poverty comes out of that Iraq war. And the basis for that war was the theft of the national oil by the fossil fuel criminals, Exxon, BP, Shell, the notorious gang. And so the reality of every drop of oil that is not sold is not true, because they haven't seen the profits of their oil for forever. So one needs to focus on who the criminals are that are manipulating the dialogue and continuously driving. Look at the United States. Look at what FERC is doing. That's being laid at the door of Biden, when it's who the people in the commission are and who they're beholden to is the reality here. And in terms of the legality of it, the International Criminal Court has been pushed to make ecocide a criminal offense. Until you make ecocide a criminal offense, you cannot bring the kinds of international criminal court cases to this court until you establish the legal framework that this criminality extends to situations like Pakistan. So, needless to say, I also was following along as much as I could stomach, and I'm severely disappointed in the outcomes. That so much manipulation was accommodated instead of putting the OPEC nations into their place in relation to
The host, Naomi.
sorry?
Look who the host was, the president of the COP,
Absolutely.
the head of,
The whole thing started out, no insult meant here, but left-handed. And so you have created a situation which you knew you were giving the floor to the criminals.
right.
But anyway, well, thank you. I rest my case.
You wanted to address Larry's comments.
I'm sorry?
Oh, Sam had wanted to, I was gonna,
I was just gonna say, when we're, one thing is even, you have to go, one thing is it's just really important to analyze everything in the text. So when Larry was talking about, the fact that liability was off the table for the loss and damage fund. Why was liability off the table for the loss and damage fund? Because in the decision accompanying the Paris Agreement, not the Paris Agreement itself, but the decision that accompanied it, in paragraph 51, they put in the fact that liability and compensation would be off the table for loss and damage, which basically takes away the idea that the global north and the historical emitters and the would be responsible for this. So when you followed into the lead up of COP, if you listen to the Pod Save the World interview of John Kerry, he was very clear to make sure this is a voluntary fund, that liability and compensation be off the table. If you go and you listen to the congressional inquiries of John Kerry, this the Republicans were very keen to ask him, trying to trap him on the issue of liability and compensation. So when you look at the history and why things happen the way they are and how this is influencing decisions today, it's really important to take this into consideration to see the effect that we have in terms of why we have this diluted loss and damage fund that is even called a loss and damage fund, and why we only have $650 million when all estimates are between $100 billion to $400 billion a year, depending on what metrics you're using, and why we have this watered down system, and why we can fund 2 wars abroad and put out an record 13.2 million barrels a day, increasing our oil production to record high levels at the same time saying that we're promoting this climate leadership. Why is this all happening? And you really have to go back and I think read a lot of the text to understand the basis for where we are now.
I see if anybody has a question, put your hand up or write star hand up in the chat, or just, give a shout out. We love for this to be a conversation amongst everybody. I see that Bruce has written a comment in the chat referring to 350.org, what Bill McKibben said. They gave a great press conference, by the way, after the decision after the first draft was given. Would you like to share with us the primary message of that link that you shared, Bruce?
First, I'd like to thank everybody who's contributed already. I'm learning a lot. I enjoy firsthand information. I think the bottom line for Bill McKibben and an increasing number of us is that we're not certain that with the COP Conference of Parties, we're going to get done what we need to by 2030. And while it seems necessary to continue working in that framework, an alternative likely also is necessary. And one way to perceive it is an alternative conference of peoples who work across national borders along thematic lines on existing initiatives, executive, legislative, and judicial, and strive to get the job done. Whether we have optimistic or pessimistic expectations, it seems as though there's a scientifically based necessity to get to major reductions, 43, 45, 50% by 2030. And if we don't, then we're toast.
Yeah, I think that even written into the text of the global stocktake was that our actions must be, and for the first time they said our actions must be supported by science and what science tells us about fossil fuels. That was also new and important acknowledgement, because this is what is, people have been saying, oh, it's a hoax, it's not scientifically. Yes, this is what the science tells us. And I think what he was in a way mirroring, Bill McKibben, what Al Gore had said, but something that also gave me a measure of optimism here. And I know that the fossil fuel lobby, there's so many here, and that is really turns people away. And I understand, because they are the devil. But I think it's important that everybody is in the room and that everybody can listen to each other. There are people here from Deloitte, from McKinsey, from, people who just want to make money. I was at a Bloomberg offsite, a lot of very wealthy people. They want to make money, but they see that it's an opportunity now, that the energy transition is an opportunity to make money, also to engage the labor and to elevate labor around the world, skilled labor, that it is not a bad thing that people from, artists, investors, scientists, activists of all kinds, indigenous people, that people from every walk of life come together in the same room, and maybe for a moment, maybe like in a conversation that I had with this Iraqi guy listening to me and me listening to him, that we can somehow join hands and forge a path forward. Of course, it's all, it's capitalism versus, the planet, but is there some hope that capitalism can drive the, redemption of the planet? I don't know. I'm thinking out loud. I'm just throwing it out there. Anybody who wants to respond with a response, please do.
Dana, can I ask you one question? Was John Kerry in any way challenged because of all of the leasing and oil and gas development that is going on in the United States? So it's back to this forked tongue. You say all this stuff, but your actions don't support what you're out there demanding other people do. Did anyone confront him?
So I actually, not about what we produce, but I had the great opportunity in an offsite to hear him speak, and I'd run into him last summer, and then I managed to grab him. It was early on. I think it was on the 5th or 5th of December, and I had a discussion with him. And what I really wanted to push on him was fossil fuel subsidies. And I said, when are they this is inexcusable, what we're doing in the United States in terms of our production and the subsidies that go along with it and the subsidies worldwide. What are you going to do about it? And he said, you are right, and I'm going to do something about it tomorrow. He said that to me. And you want to know that the next day in an article, I think I posted it somewhere, he announced that is his, and it was the next day, that is the next thing he wants to tackle. Yes, the United States drilled more oil and gas in 2022 than ever in history. We have to peak and stop.
And coal from the Tennessee Valley Authority is still at it in Appalachia. I mean, that's criminal.
Yes.
On subsidies, the final statement says phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that do not address energy poverty or just transitions as soon as possible. So, of course, kind of hedging there with what's efficient, what are efficient subsidies and what are inefficient subsidies.
So we can go, there are so many loopholes in these, final negotiation statements, so many loopholes. It's a possibility of just what Bill McKibben says. We can do something with it. It can really mean that we're on the path, but it can also mean we can just weasel out of it and we're doomed. I see Karen has her hand up. Karen.
Yeah. Okay. I have kind of a question if you ran into it. What Naomi just said about we've got to stop coal now, and all this drilling that we put in, like, this record drilling in 2022, where we also imported oil from around the world, 40% of which was from Canada. I just looked at not a Department of Energy, but something on the government website yesterday, Department of the Navy statistics. And then I asked somebody I knew who has some contact with stuff, have you ever seen a plan, like the plan, where, if we close all the coal mines and the oil wells tomorrow, we do a big favor for the planet. But as with the Willow Project, we would run into local opposition, like from our Democratic representative in Alaska, who points out that their whole social safety net rests upon their oil that they're drilling out. And so, they've got some considerations there. We have considerations for the jobs of the people who work in these industries. And we also have I don't know if I just said to replace what we're losing from one energy stream with the renewables that we're trying to ramp up now via all of the legislation that the Biden administration has passed, which still isn't quite enough, and which the MAGA Republicans are still saying that, but we have to get Trump back in office so that we can drill oil again. It's like, whoa, wait a minute, we are drilling oil. What is the master plan? Have you ever seen one? And the person I knew who had a contact in the industry said, no, I don't think I have. Where, you take 10 jobs out here and you train them with subsidies to work in this other industry, and then you close down 10% of this industry and you open up the other 10% of the other industry. Where's the timeline and the plan just in the United States, even forgetting the rest of the world, for how we're going to phase this thing? We keep talking in headlines. We've got to phase it out. We've got to keep it in the ground. We keep talking about it, but I haven't seen the numbers that I could shoot over to that guy who gave me the Trump has got to come back in so we can drill again and say, this is what's going to happen. Is there a plan?
I think that the idea, and this is what the Chinese were also stressing, they were a vital force at this conference. Of course, they're producing so much of the renewable technology, the solar panels, et cetera, and they are very keen to help solve this problem, let's say. But the way they wanted to position it was, we will have a phase down of fossil fuels with the phase up of renewables, because they understand, and I think this is what the position in the United States is too, that it seems that we're just adding renewables to meet our growing energy demands, the population, the industry. We're demanding more and more energy and we're not keeping up, but we need to ramp up the renewables to the point, and they are. I mean, the technology is improving, the cost of the renewables is plummeting. It takes time, but I think that is the plan, that they're working on these technologies. They're working to replace them, but they don't want to create some kind of economic disaster by just not providing the energy which is needed to function for an industrial society to function.
Or by publishing the plan, perhaps, because that would give some other people a leg up on which places to invest in. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'd like to see the numbers. And it's, heartening to hear that the Chinese probably have a plan. And probably, I couldn't read it because I don't read Chinese, but if they published it in English, we could maybe look at it. But I've never seen one for the United States where we could put the numbers out to people and not just keep arguing with our counterparts, our MAGA friends, and even some of our more conservative Democrats, saying, but, what about? It's like, well, here's what about. It's 4 here, 3 there by 2025. And then, I've never seen one. And I'd just like to know if there is one somewhere, a master plan.
Larry or Sam, do you have a response to this?
I'm guessing that in the US, it's probably more at the state level, no? At least in Europe, in the European Union, there is a just transition fund, but at the European level, European Union can only do so much. It's a big institution, but still their budget is just a fraction of the sum of the budgets of the 27 member states. So I think, and also clearly the employment situation is different in each country. So Poland is going to have to retrain all of their coal miners, whereas in France they have a lot of nuclear electricity, so that probably wouldn't be such a big issue, such a big challenge.
Sam?
Yeah, I guess I'm not particularly knowledgeable on that question. I did work on with the Department of Interior for several years, and yeah, I mean, the federal plan would probably more likely involve the federal lands and what would be the master plan there, but I don't really have much particular knowledge on that question. I guess I was gonna respond to your question on the capitalism, but I can get back to that later.
Well, I see that Bruce has got his hand up and wants to ask a question. Bruce, hearing from you.
Comments and questions are giving us a lot of food for thought. Thinking about what Karen is asking about, where's the plan? I think a couple possible answers to that are take a look at what Janet Granholm was trying to do in West Virginia to encourage Joe Manchin to sign on to a more ambitious, what turned out to be the Inflation Reduction Act. And what she was promising him if he were willing to help in West Virginia transition away from coal. That would be one way of looking at it. Another one is that when you say plan, it can start to sound a little bit like planned economy and perhaps anathema to the free market economy. So there may be some hesitance at the federal level to go beyond the Inflation Reduction Act, focus on also just transitions and trying to make sure that underserved communities receive 40% of Inflation Reduction Act spending. Final comment about what Dana was saying, we're using more and more renewable energy, but we're also just using more energy, period. So it could be that you would triple the capacity by 2030 for renewable energy and still end up with what my question asks. Is it possible that with the current NDCs, the UN is claiming maybe by 2030 we would only have a net reduction of 2%? Isn't it so necessary to really phase out fossil fuel production and consumption so that we don't have that ramping up of renewable energy, but also ramping up of energy use, and in the end, not getting much greenhouse gas emission reduction at all?
I have to say, Bruce, this is why there was a very strong contingent at the COP, and young people from a lot of different countries, especially the Nordic countries, pushing nuclear energy, fourth generation nuclear energy that's built with safety, high level safety measures and storage issues, because that is an important, but considered by many, an extremely important bridge technology until we can get to the point of meeting our energy needs with renewable energy. I know that in many circles and of the climate movement, that nuclear energy is scorned in Germany and a lot of friends we have in France, but it has certainly there is an argument to be made there.
So I would suggest that anyone that wants to go down the nuclear energy road should go and have a discussion on site with the Dene, where Trinity took place, and see the way the Navajo are living with the tailings of uranium mining, what it has done to them. It has never been addressed. And anytime you want nuclear energy, you have to mine the bloody stuff. And that's the same issue with fossil fuels. There is never a discussion about the environmental destruction that takes place in getting the stuff out of the ground.
Extractionism.
It is not just about burning. It is not just about the emissions. It is about the complete and total degradation of environments
Yes.
that these extractions, that this exploration and extractions create. So just as with carbon, one needs to really look at the entire footprint of whatever the product is that we are discussing, and putting that in a balance so that we really see what the totality of the thing costs. Nuclear energy is a fiasco, and the fiasco resides with the mining of uranium.
Point well taken, and it's very important to highlight the devastation that extractionism has on the ecology of a region and the frontline and indigenous communities that live there. Mohammed has had his hand up for a long time. I'd like to turn to him. He has a question. And again, I want to say before he speaks that he did a great job appearing with us at our live streaming, during one of our live streaming events during the day of youth empowerment. So I want to acknowledge that and thank him for the excellent job he did. Mohammed?
Yeah, and really interesting conversation here. I again want to, right, I agree with what Naomi said. I am very concerned about the influence OPEC countries had in this agreement. And right, there were moments where it looked like it would fail. I was reading the New York article about the letter the OPEC Secretary General sent to the OPEC Plus saying, don't agree to any draft that targets fossil fuel instead of emissions. And I'm just worried that that was really shocking to see uh, the OPEC trying to influence a climate agreement. And that's something I've always thought as soon as Sultan Al Jaber was announced as COP28 president and the UAE being the COP28 host, that, the oil industry, yes, needs to be in the conversation, but that doesn't mean they're the ones leading, the agreements or how we should be, fixing a big problem. So my question is, so number one, how can we include the oil industry, OPEC, all these oil producing countries in the conversation without them controlling the narrative? And then number two, right, the agreement had some, I was, again, I'll have to go back to agreement, right? In that same New York article, the the Saudi minister said that it would not affect the Saudis' capacity for retrieving oil and right selling that. So and
Because
then right you had
it's non-binding, unfortunately. I have to say, in the one of the talks that I heard that Carrie gave, there was some real naming and shaming of specific countries, companies involved in fossil fuel extraction. And it was just after the methane pledge had been discussed that he called out Chevron for being one of the real devils there and making no attempts to really control flaring and methane, and did cite Exxon, who was trying to diversify and trying to abide by new regulations. And I think it would be fair. Of course, the whole fossil fuel industry, they're like the smoking, the tobacco producers. But perhaps some are more enlightened and more willing to take part in this conversation, in this transition, than others. But OPEC, Saudi Arabia, I think it was interesting that Al Jaber actually went against the wishes of the Saudi nation and allowed that language to come in, allowed that compromise. Does anybody else have? I also want to acknowledge John Capiche. Yes, Mohammed?
No, I just wanted to finish that, right? The agreement also called for like accelerating carbon capture and storage, which some environment group says it's right potential. It's like a way that will allow the extended use of fossil fuel. So
Yes.
what do you guys think about all of that?
I think that it's important to continue developing that technology, but that you use so much energy at this point just to capture any carbon that it's fruitless at this point in history. But eventually, we may need it. But John is an engineer. I want to introduce John Capiche. He was our live streaming partner. He's the chair of the Florida Environmental Caucus. And he's joined us a little bit late today, but really happy to have him on board. And he's an engineer. And I think that he could speak with more knowledge and experience towards these technologies and just what they mean now and in the future. John?
Well, thank you, Dana. And I just to let everyone know, very much enjoyed working with Dana and Angela this past couple of weeks in doing these Zoom briefings. It was just a wonderful, wonderful experience. Hard work, but good experience. On carbon capture, it's basically an economic issue. I mean, there's any number of ways you generate CO2, and fossil fuels is top among them. And from stepping back and looking at COP and the language to phase down fossil fuels, I think the greatest significance of that language in the final communique or quote agreement, non-binding agreement, is that this is the first time it's ever been in there after 28 years. I think more than anything, people's reaction is, what? You hadn't decided that, 20 years ago? You're only now getting around to that? How can that possibly be? What have you people been doing at these meetings the past 28 years? So, it's kind of ridiculous. It's non-binding. And what that tells you when it's non-binding, it tells you that just economics is going to dictate the outcome. These governments are in no way prepared to start pushing this issue in any serious fashion. And it reminds me of an experience I had. My background is engineering, agricultural engineering. I'm a hydrologist, water quality specialist. but I also deal a lot with energy because energy is fundamental to any sort of natural system. So when you're doing hydrologic modeling, you're modeling based upon the weather and how it interacts with the soils and the vegetation and so on. So basically you're doing climate modeling just on a smaller scale. And when you look at the carbon capture technology, I actually recommended back in 2006 that Florida take advantage of that. They were proposing a coal-fired power plant, and I thought, well, that's just absolutely ridiculous. But if you're going to do it, at least, you know, go after the dollars from the federal government and become an experimental site for carbon capture and sequestration. Well, eventually the government did that, and they spent like $1 billion on that project in Mississippi, and it pretty much failed. Not necessarily because of technology, but because everybody was looting and pillaging those federal funds and stumbling their way through this first project. So it was kind of a shameful experience for the federal government in pursuing this. And they basically just said, never again, thank you very much. But, you know, carbon capture is going on now, direct air capture. And direct air capture is not the most efficient way. The most efficient way is to actually pull it out of the oceans, pull it out of the water. At least that's what my readings have suggested. And, you know, oil's selling now at about $80 a barrel. When you look at the cost of carbon capture and sequestration, you're looking at about $54 a barrel, $50 a barrel under current technologies. So, you know, if you were paying $130 a barrel for oil, conceivably you could take $54 of that and put it into capturing the carbon from it. But, you know, that's an additional subsidy. And who's to say if you pulled away that, what, $4 to $7 trillion a year in global fossil fuel subsidies, that the price of oil wouldn't skyrocket up to $150 a barrel. And it's been as high as what, $200 a barrel, you know, historically. So, you know, it's basically economics, and the various technologies of alternate ways of producing energy then come into play as far as competing with fossil fuels. And I think ultimately that's what's going to determine the outcome. If we can drive down the cost of clean energy production. And I don't think solar and wind is going to do it. You know, I do think that nuclear is going to have to be part of that, not the old pressurized water reactors that are basically these ticking time bombs. But, you know, there's all sorts of technologies that we have not pursued. And a lot of technologies that, you know, breeder reactors would use the existing spent fuel as its source. You know, you could look at the molten salt reactor, use some of the thorium that's sitting around in huge piles everywhere in the world, you know, already dug up out of the ground and just piled up. I mean, we've missed the opportunity to at least do some research and development and develop prototypes of these new reactors so that they would constitute options for us. But, you know, mining's a problem. Mining's a problem for uranium. It's a problem for, you know, all the various other rare earth metals and other products, you know, resources that are needed for solar and wind. I think geothermal has a lot of potential. But as a bottom line, we really have to drive down the cost of clean, carbon neutral energy sources, because as was pointed out, we're going to need so much more energy. Replacing our current energy isn't nearly enough. There's 6 billion people on the planet that want to elevate their standard of living, and that's going to take a lot of energy. And so you got those 6 billion, that dwarfs the additional new energy we're going to need for an additional 25% growth in our population. So, you know, we've known the solution since 1980, because I sat around with graduate students and faculty in the early 1980s talking about climate change, and actually talking about where we would be now in 2020, 2030. And so none of this is a surprise. All of it is just a shame that we've waited this long to really do anything about it. Now I see a question in there.
Sam has been waiting to
Sure.
make a question, so I really want to turn to Sam now.
Apologize. I was actually good responding to Bruce's question about the UN study that shows that the NDC, the National Determined Contribution Reduction, would contribute to 2% reduction in emissions globally. I think this also would tie back to your original question about like the role of capitalism in all of this. But I think what we have to also really think about is reducing emissions will depend on so much on how we finance mitigation in the developing world. As of now, at this moment, not based on historical contributions, but 63% of emissions are now coming from developing countries. So it's really going to take an all hands on deck approach from the public, private, and philanthropic sectors. And we really need to and reimagine how we envision the global financial architecture, which is kind of what spurred the first half of the global climate finance discussions this year. So as Avinash Prasad, the author of the Bridgetown Initiative, put it, in rich countries, 81% of mitigation is funded through the private sector, but in developing countries, only 14% is. The rest is funded through the public sector due to currency risk, high loan rates, and other factors. Climate finance, simply put, is not flowing at the rate it should. We need trillions of dollars. If you look at the latest report from Climate Policy Initiative that shows, it's I think it's like $7 trillion a year by 2030, something astronomical. And so we need to understand, going back to your question on capitalism, we have to understand the limitations currently imposed by the global economic system, but that doesn't mean that we can it's important to listen to calls on reforming the global financial architecture or even overhauling it. It's also critical to remember that many of these countries are already overburdened with debt, so we need to focus on alleviating these burdens. This can be done through grants, concessional loans, and even increasing loans to the private sector to take the burden off the public sector. So I think there is a role for capitalism in terms of farming out the mitigation, in terms of reducing the overall emissions, since right now the NDCs. And it's also critical to remember that the global stocktake is important to inform the next round of NDCs. And hopefully with the idea of transitioning away from fossil fuels, this will give some hope to getting below that 2% mark.
That's a lot of food for thought. And let's see. I think that Brian has been waiting patiently for a long time. We've been so enthusiastically engaging in lots of questions here. Brian, would you like to pose?
I have a question relating to carbon capture, because I'm afraid that it's mostly, or it's going to end up, if this was implemented, that it would just end up as an excuse to continue emitting carbon. And similar to how when you do earthwork for anything engineering related, you can never, when you disturb the earth, you can never compact it down to its original undisturbed form. And I kind of see, carbon in the same sense where, when it's kept in the ground, it's not going to, that's better than disturbing it and then, trying to figure out, okay, well, how do we put it back into the ground? How do we put this, toothpaste back in the tube? How is there even a way that you can safely store the carbon, with carbon capture? Like, I just don't even, I don't see how there's a way.
Lisa, I'd really like to hear from Lisa. She's been, I'm an activist in Hamburg and also a scientist, neuroscientist who has been looking at the impact of pollution on our brains, our neural functioning, and want to give her the opportunity to ask a question.
Yeah, thank you, Dana. Actually, I posted one thing in the chat already, and that is somehow I have a feeling on the one hand, yes, industry and government have to take action, but on the other hand, I want to get your perspective on how you think one can, at least in those countries that are still democratic, let's put it that way, to mobilize the masses, maybe toward a specific event, to like these boycotts that we used to have when I was a child about grapes. I mean, everything is so intertwined now, but I think only that way can one send a message and at the same time then alter the markets. I mean, it would be a large effort, but somehow I think that is one path, which also basically reduces things, which goes in the same line that nobody or hardly any people talk about sufficiency, which is actually also the only way, because everything is increasing. You get a new PC because the other software doesn't work anymore on the old one, and the energy demands are just increasing. And that's when suddenly it does really say, well, basically it's related to the thing that we can't keep growing and can't improving, that we have to, one can turn it this way and call it this and call it that. But basically, yeah, that one has to be more sufficient in order to have this incentive of not always increasing and not making it sound as though it's like a taboo term or taboo effect. And yeah, wanted to get your impressions on that.
Mass movements and boycotts, which have been effective in some movements. They really have. I think Larry would be perfect to address this, as he helped found a movement in Belgium, Climate Rising, is that the name of it? And I think you really are a true activist getting out there. Do you want to address Lisa's question?
I'm really sorry, I got distracted. Can you just summarize it for me? And I'll be glad to share what I've been working on in Belgium.
Do you want to do it, Dana? Yeah. Basically, how or your perspective on if it's realistic to try to mobilize the people, the masses, especially of still democratic societies, to, let's say, on Earth Day or so, have a boycott of oil products, of plastics, not to buy things that have plastic with them, or that one has to exactly decide upon it, basically kind of have some kind of a boycott short term, see how efficient that is. And then if one gets a lot of people, try to repeat it.
Yeah, I actually thought of that myself the other day when I was reading this New York Times article that was explaining how Saudi Arabia behind the scenes was using every negotiating trick to try to block, the mention of fossil fuels in the final communique. And so I was thinking, okay, how could we launch a global boycott of any oil coming from Saudi Arabia? But yeah, I mean, some boycotts have been somewhat successful, at least in sort of raising awareness. Yeah, it's really difficult to. My experience is that we reach people who are already convinced, and so the question is, how do you build awareness among people who are not that well informed or just don't feel that they can really do much themselves. It was interesting. I had the opportunity to interview Bertrand Piccard. He's a Swiss adventurer who was the first to fly around the world in a hot air balloon. And then some years later, he flew around the world in a solar powered airplane. And now he has set up some years ago, he set up a foundation called the Solar Impulse Foundation. And he was at COP to present a document, a kind of a memorandum with the title, A New Climate Narrative. And so his whole idea is that we need to change the language and not the sort of very negative, scaremongering language that activists typically use, saying, we're heading for disaster and the fossil fuel companies are murderers and criminals. And so this document really presents ways that you can you can explain the need to do this transition but in positive terms. And it was what you were saying at the beginning, Dana, about, the economic benefits of the transition, and how there'll be new jobs being created. If we eliminate fossil fuels, it'll also improve health, since pollution kills millions of people every year.
People in the United States alone every year. 7 million. Amazing. It's true. A lot of food for thought. Time is going, this is such an interesting conversation, and time is rushing by. Naomi has been waiting patiently to ask another question, and I am looking forward to hearing from her.
It's
Why?
actually not a question, but the whole conversation makes me think back to when recycling was introduced into New York City. And the mantra surrounding recycling was really the 3 R's. And the first of those R's was reduce. And so if one looks at the human impact on the globe, wherever we have established our communities, outside of an indigenous approach, which is more reciprocity of you can't just take, you have to give back. But I think that a strategy that has not been explored enough is reducing. How do we use less of everything that we have taken for granted? And that has also an economic impact, because if all of us used less of all of this stuff, then there is less interest by the fossil fuel industry to develop more and more. And I see here.
Behavior change, though, Naomi.
Sorry?
It's so difficult to impact behavioral change.
Correct. But it needs to be part of the conversation, the same way that whatever it is we do, what is the entire footprint of the entire impact footprint of all of it? So here in Switzerland, in spite of all of the challenges and petitions, they just approved billions and billions of Swiss francs for expanding the road system. The road system doesn't need expanding. And instead of focusing on reducing and improve and building more railroad tracks, they're now going to build more and more roads, which will reduce green space, which is what it always does. It will increase pollution, because what roads introduce into the land and groundwater is extraordinary. So why isn't there more of a dialogue of individuals reducing their usage, reducing their car usage, reducing the heating in the house? All of this business isn't discussed enough. That's my
I think it is.
offering.
In my circles, it's discussed, but it's probably not discussed at a, up and down, vertically and horizontally enough.
Well, especially in schools. The only reason that the New York City recycling program was a success was when it got into the school, and kids would come home and say to their parents, No, you don't put it there, or you don't put that into that's not recyclable. This goes in the green and this goes in the blue, and it was the kids
Mhm.
that made the program a success. So maybe we need to introduce how children can promote reduction in the homes that they live in.
Yeah,
Just a thought.
there was the comment you made, John, to Naomi about consumerism where we are in Dubai.
Oh, it's, we went to the, or at least I went to the Dubai Mall at the foot of the tallest building in the world. Oh my God. I thought Americans were bad. These people just are like wallowing in a mud hole of consumerism. I mean, every single brand had a outlet store in that fancy mall, and those people were walking around in designer clothes and cool haircuts. And the only good thing about it was a lot of them used the metro to get there. But I look in all these stores, and most of it is just stuff nobody really needs, but all of those people seem to want. And I just don't get it. And that's the problem. You're trying to mobilize a people that have been enculturated into a bizarre mindset. And good luck trying to deal with that, because democracy, you talk about democracy doing it. Democracy to me seems like just a system that divides up the spoils of capitalism. If you expect to get any change out of people, it's not likely to come from a democratic system. The best you can hope out of democracy is technology and innovation, because that's what it promotes. So I don't know. I don't have any solutions, given the mentality of the vast majority of people on this planet.
I would like to see us really move away from such a huge consumption of meat. The methane that is produced from agriculture and from the cattle industry and what it does in so many countries. How do you really impact behavioral change? This is, the $1 million question. I'd like
The Hindus did it with the religion.
Yes, they did.
Right?
Yeah, they did. They don't eat meat. They don't eat beef anyway.
Right.
I'd like to turn to Brian. He's been waiting again patiently to ask a question, and time is running. Brian?
I had a question, because someone brought up earlier, I think it was Naomi. It was actually in regards to uranium mining, but we have the same issue when it comes to green I guess other renewable technologies, specifically lithium mining. Was that ever mentioned in at COP? Because particularly with respect to, lithium mining, in order to, I guess, satiate the demand of for example, for the US, for electric vehicles, the amount of lithium that we need, do we even have, is there even enough lithium in the world to satiate the demand for, converting, everything to, converting our combustible cars to electric vehicles, or, yeah, I just don't know if that's, it just seems like it's not even discussed, like that we can just somehow, convert everything to, electric vehicles and not even, confront the elephant in the room when it comes to, should we, be also considering, pushing Americans to use, more public transport and providing the infrastructure for that transport, more high-speed rail, more, better public transit within cities. Obviously, I used to be a traffic engineer, so I kind of know a little bit about, how our land use is very heavily slanted towards, cars and and our zoning laws, particularly in the US, they heavily favor detached single family homes, and that sort of of infrastructure doesn't really mesh well with public transit, and also because we're so spread out, at least in the context of the US, it makes it difficult, understandably, for train service to reach, particularly those rural communities. Sorry if I'm, ranting here, but I'm kind of, dragging this out. But back to what I was originally saying, I just don't know if there's doesn't really seem to be a lot of, focus that's put on, in order to make this green transition. It requires a lot of, lithium mining, particularly in countries like Bolivia, Chile,
Not
here in
just
Argentina.
cobalt and other rare minerals. And there was a lot of discussion. There were a lot of panels of which I attended, even Chinese panels, which were discussing this because it's so vital to their industry. And I think there is, at least in name, there's a lot of discussion about elevating labor, protecting labor, making sure this is done in the most efficient, both efficient in economic terms and efficient in terms of protection as possible in name. That doesn't mean the reality on the ground, but I see.
Dana, I think there is quite a bit of research being done to find alternative strategies to lithium as well as other rare earth materials. I mean, it's understood that extraction comes with environmental destruction, and that requires a lot of research.
So we're talking about, it depends on what technology. Yes, there's research all the time. And in terms of battery storage, yes, there are many types of batteries in the pipeline being experimented on, which may prove economically efficient enough to really be able to scale up.
Right.
But other rare minerals, which are necessary for other technologies that we use.
And
do you have?
I am interested. I am interested to know, about this, what sort of research there is into alternatives to lithium, because the advantage of lithium is that it's light, and obviously it's not as energy dense as, fossil fuels, but I am curious to know what the engineers are, potentially cooking up, the engineers and scientists who are researching this.
Podcasts and YouTube channels, which what was the one that I recommended to Karen? Karen, what was the one that I recommended to you that you liked so much?
Undecided. I just put it in the chat a while ago. Matt Farrell.
There are a bunch of sources, that are always coming out with new material, what's coming up, what's being tested. I'm sure that you'll have fun going down a rabbit hole exploring those.
Well, MIT, there's an awful lot of research being conducted into alternative approaches to solar, as well as this whole battery storage and lithium. Who else? ETH in Switzerland also has a lot of research going on in these areas. But MIT is well known for looking at different ways to develop renewables that are sustainable.
I think one thing that you brought up in terms of the development of lithium and other renewables fueling a new wave of extractionism in Latin America, there's been, especially from Global South NGOs at the COP, there's been a growing backlash among the constant gutting of human rights references into the text which are always a struggle to get in. And many times they're just included at the high level because, I mean, in terms of if there is going to be this new wave of extractionism to fund, you know, what will essentially amount to a global Green New Deal or whatever you want to call it, it's gonna create these kinds of issues where there's a potential, and especially now with in terms of the increased multilateral development bank lending, in terms of moving this outside the UNFCCC and moving away from the from under the CMA, you're opening us up to increased human rights violations. So I think it's definitely a concern that these technologies can fund can cause these types of issues. So it was important to highlight that as well.
Interesting. Yeah, it has been fascinating for me to see the Latin American community here and what strong NGOs and organizations, civil society organizations coming up from there, representing indigenous people, representing the global South and those vulnerable frontline communities. I think more so than any other region I've seen represented. It must be fascinating for you also being there. Sam is based in Costa Rica and works a lot with Colombia and other members of the Latin American community. Let's see, do we have anybody waiting? Bruce has ended. He has sent me a message. Okay. And Naomi has had to leave, but I wanted to share this with everybody before she left. But next month's Climate Cafe will be featuring Naomi Zurcher, who has been calling in from Switzerland. She is an urban forester and has a long, rich career behind her, still doing very interesting things. And I think it will be a fascinating discussion. I've already learned so much hearing from her experience. But does anybody, we're getting really at the top of the hour now, does anybody have another burning question or some comment, frustration that they'd like to share with us before we say good night or good day, wherever you're calling from?
I think I'll just say one thing, which is we do need more younger voices at the table where climate agreements are being made, right? To have a seat, because it is our future. It is, this planet's future that we are worrying about. And this issue is a very big issue for majority of us.
I couldn't agree more, Mohammed. And I want to share one last thing, which is totally related to that, which was shocking and disappointing in many ways. There was a young girl, a 12-year-old girl who came in maybe one of the last days, one of the last plenaries, came with a sign, and she's a known climate activist named Lisi from India. And she ran up on the stage with a sign shouting for her voice to be heard about climate justice and about phasing out fossil fuels. And she went on for a couple of minutes and people weren't sure what to do, and security started to approach her. Then everybody started applauding in full throttle for this girl. She wasn't even a young woman, she was a girl. And finally, someone whispered something in her ear and she started to cry, and then she was escorted out, but everybody was clapping for her. She was escorted out by a security, and then the Egypt former president gave her another round of applause. Let's give her another. We need people like her. We need the youth. We need the activists. We need all of you to achieve what we have achieved and what we will achieve. And he was very gracious. And I was happy about that. It actually made me cry. He's like, give her another applause. But do you know what? I found out after the meeting, she was stripped of her badge, and she will not be able to attend any COPs she was stripped of her badge by the UNFCCC and will not be able to attend any COP for 5 years. Yes, we need the voices of the youth. Yes, we need the voices of the indigenous. Yes, we need the voices of the people on the front lines, because it's their world that we're destroying too, and they're the most vulnerable. I couldn't agree more with you, Mohammed.
But I would just add that I'm really impressed by the youth activists who are present, who speak on panels, who are just so knowledgeable and so eloquent and articulate. That I find really, really encouraging. And so I think it's good that the UNFCCC and the COP28 presidency does give them that chance to be there. I also heard from an organization, and I unfortunately I didn't catch the name, but they train youth to be negotiators. And so these young people can actually be in the room with the negotiations going on and participate, not just as spectators, but actually really getting involved in the negotiations.
Yeah, that's great. And there were a lot of amazing youths. This young Filipino woman, who, I don't know if you would recognize her if you saw her. She was fabulous. A young German man, I think 19 years old, who's also a poet and a musician, and he was extraordinary. He had the chance to interview Gore for one of the panels. He was the interview for Gore. His name was Joshua Stabe. He's now gone to study in the United States, but he's a young German man. So they do give a platform to young people, but it was disappointing to see what they did to this boy.
We do need the message of the youth, and we need the passion and the organizing. However, don't fool yourself that these young people are not, some of them are not also self-serving politicians in training. I mean, you have to get to know these people before you can have much confidence in them and their long-term intentions or how they might use any notoriety or power. We need to achieve the things that they're espousing, but you have to be careful because often, people will espouse necessary and useful things for, other ends. So, don't get fooled. I can tell you, I work with a lot of these folks, and I've been running, university student organizations for decades and still am. And you got to get to know these people to know if they're the real deal or if they're just putting on a show and looking to climb a ladder.
Well, plenty of them are the real deal. And it is the youth that will inherit this planet. It is the youth that has the most at stake. It's my children.
And we have to teach to differentiate between those people because our generation has done a terrible job of that.
A terrible job. And on that note, we are a bit over time now. So I want to thank you for a riveting conversation. I'm just delighted. Please do join us next month on January 17th for our Climate Cafe. And thank you for joining us tonight. And keep asking the questions. Keep having the conversations. And thank you so much for joining us.